Well, howdy, howdy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, you lovely folks joining me here over at Marvel Snap Zone. Welcome back to our YouTube. It's been a hot second, and it's really good to see you once again. We've been in a bit of a weird spot with Marvel Snap. As most of you know, if you've been long-time players, we normally expect some kind of balance patch or some kind of regular update as a new season starts, which we've just had, of course, with the Nick Fury season beginning. And it kind of didn't happen. A number of folks over at Second Dinner have kind of explained why some things didn't necessarily go to plan. And of course, things got delayed with everything they've got going on right now. So we've been stuck in a bit of a stale meta game, but slowly but surely, the game hasn't waited for that patch. It's kind of evolved nonetheless, regardless of no balance changes that may or may not be very, very needed. And we feel comfortable that there is finally enough information to talk about to provide you with a brand new shiny tier list for Marvel Snap of the top decks you can expect to play against when you're grinding cubes, and kind of take it from there. We do have some good news. One of the comments we used to get quite a lot about this segment is that it was based on writers' opinions, and that wasn't necessarily the best for content like this. It was the best we had, but we understood the concern. Thankfully, we do have some data to start remedying that problem now, as we head into the global release of Marvel Snap. It's not long now. It's about a month until finally we have a worldwide release for the game. So this list is actually informed by two small sets of data. The first is our own Cube Rush events. If you're not familiar, there's some more details down in the description box below, but Marvel Snap Zone has collaborated with content creator Luke Muncher in order to run a pseudo-competitive game series for Marvel Snap. Content creators can play once a week, and the community can play once a season. And we had our first Community Rush event for that last Wednesday, so we actually have some data from that event to work with, which is fantastic. And then second, and certainly not least, we have some data provided by the lovely folks over at Snap.fan, a great app that lets you keep track of your Marvel Snap games and your Marvel Snap data to help inform us about win rates and about level of play of decks and popularity and this kind of stuff. So all the data you would expect from an informed tier list. So we have a better idea cohesively of what's going on moving forward. It is still important to remember, though, that this data is fundamentally flawed. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of bot games on the ladder, and bot games are not human games and don't give an accurate representation of what things actually look like. And of course, those bots naturally play selected deck lists for them too. So please do keep that in mind, and we're sure that data will kind of clear itself up as we head into commercial release. As always, if what you want is just the tier list, you want deck lists and nothing else, going to pop it on the screen for you in just a second, but you can hop over to the article version of this in our description box below, grab those deck lists, export them, get playing straight away. No need to wait for anything else. But if you are interested in what these decks do, the cards they play, what they're about, as always, I'm going to try and break them down for you so you can better understand what it is that they do in the game of Marvel Snap and hopefully build something that you think is going to be pretty fun. So, with all that being said, if you haven't subscribed already, please do. I want to keep doing this, we want to keep doing this, and we want to support Marvel Snap as it heads into its worldwide release. So consider hitting that button, hit the bell, turn on notifications, help us out and in bringing this back and continuing to do series like this, like the podcasts that we host here and the articles that we publish for strategy. It means a lot. Thank you very much. Let's take a look at the tier list for Season 4. Let's take a look at our first one. Okay, so a lot of familiar faces here in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, so on and so forth. Realising you can't actually see tier names as it's currently positioned, so let me move that in ever so slightly. We'll deal with the scuffed corner. Yeah, a lot of familiar faces, but a lot of new faces too, which is actually super reassuring. You can see that we've removed the up and downs this week because things have changed so dramatically in the space of a short period of time, and our last tiered list was a few weeks ago. So, undisputed king of Tier 1, the best deck in the game by a significant margin before any patches, Sarah Negative, continues to be an all-star, easily the top of the food chain, and the deck to play if all you care about is winning and cubes and nothing else. Tier 2, however, really wide variety of decks available to you as the decks just underneath. We have Dracula Discard, the pure Mr. Negative deck, the Sarah Miracle deck, the Hella Discard deck, Lockjaw on reveal, One Going, a fan favourite that's occasionally been missed from the list, and the Patriot deck as well, which is super sweet. Tier number 3, just a little bit lower, but still kind of notching wins on their belt. We have access to Soundwave Lockdown, the Daredevil Control deck, which is a new addition by all means. Deathpool, the more modern update to the Death Wave deck we've been used to seeing for quite some time. And then Tier 4, we have the Destroyer deck, Bounce Brothers combo, Beast, Falcon Shenanigans, and the Cerebro 3 deck finding its way into tier number 4 this week. Last but not least, we've got those 3 budget options if you want to be challenging this tier list and you don't necessarily have access to the entirety of Pool 3. This week, those are the Pool 2 Swarm deck, a Control Shell built out of Pool 2, and a Disruption Shell built out of Pool 2. If you're looking for those deck lists, you want coverage of those, they're going to be on the website. I'm not going to be talking through those in today's video. So please consider going and hopping over there, checking those out, and grabbing a budget deck list of your choice. Okay, that being said, let us start taking a look at some of these deck lists in a bit more detail, and hopefully I can talk you through some of the data about why they're where they are and how they work. Fingers crossed, he says, hopefully, before having to press some buttons and hope that nothing breaks. Perfect, okay. So, starting things off here with the big cheese, the one that we're all kind of familiar with at this point. The undisputed king of tier 1 before any nerfs is Negative Serotonin, the Sera-Negative deck, championed by so many of our largest content creators. First of all, this deck won 2 Cube Rushes back-to-back, both a Creator Cube Rush and the Community Rush. One of those in the hands of Agent Carter, well-known player for grinding stupid amounts of cubes. And Vin Kelser, the other one, the content creator cube race, also taking it down with Sera-Negative to the best of my knowledge. This one really needs no introduction, but we have some data to back up the fact this is the best deck in the game now. If you want to look at pure win rate, 55.16%. Average cubes per game, 0.8. Best deck in the game during Season 4. The only competition is actually Khazar Pool 1 when you want to look at win rate, because it's the go-to deck for beginners, so obviously it has quite a lot of play in the early stages of the game. But when we enter the realm of full collections, the deck is nearly a whole % above every other deck, and therefore this deserves to be in tier 1 by itself. If you aren't familiar with this deck, it's utilising some of the most ridiculous powerhouses the game currently has to offer in the form of Mr. Negative, inverting all those stats so that everything costs what it has in attack value and vice versa. And Sarah to make everything cost 1 cheaper on the final turn of the game because it's a 5-cost unit. However, this does mean that this deck, while not doing early game things necessarily, just does the most ridiculous turns 6 and 7. It gains access to turn 7 courtesy of magic. But you can just put your whole hand on the table and bring piles and piles of stats out of nowhere, which is quite frankly ridiculous. Cards like Angela, Bishop, these are just suddenly 1-cost and 2-cost units. Sometimes even 0-cost and 1-cost units if you happen to Mystique Sarah, which is otherworldly, of course. Sometimes Mystique costs 0 due to Mr. Negative. You can kind of see how these things add up together. But you can just make your whole hand cost nothing in the grand scheme of things with this deck. And between effects like, Iron Man, Blue Marvel, Angela and Bishop growing, Mojo being huge from every lane being filled, you just present a very large amount of stats no one else can really keep up with. And you do it on the last 2 turns of the game. So it's really hard for the opponent to have any counterplay and move back and forth in order to kind of like counterplay against what you're doing. So definitely the best deck to be playing right now if you have access to the deck. Sera-Negative remains a kingpin of all things Marvel Snap. So moving down to tier 2, we're going to take a look at Dracula Discard. This one was once a tier 1 kingpin of the game before the August 9th patch, but the Hell Cow nerf kind of had everybody doubting the strength of Discard as a whole ever since. It had a couple other nerfs that affected it too. Things like the Collector, which used to be all-stars in this archetype, kind of knocked it down a peg. But this has been the favoured deck of that creator we talked about previously, Agent Carter, who is known to be one of the highest ranked Infinite players, grinding like over 18,000 cubes or something stupid since the beta began. It's looking to claim that top spot back. It's going for a fight, kind of known as Discard Combo here, if you're not familiar with it in the past. You're basically trying to rely on the synergy between Wong and Discard effects and Dracula to do a number of different things. So Wong and discard effects are going to just dump piles of stuff into your discard. Hopefully you're hitting swarms and duplicating those, making your Morbius is huge. But the big one now is very much Apocalypse. This deck is now built to utilize discard Apocalypse as often as possible, make this thing gargantuan, because that means at the end of the game you're going to have Dracula discard Apocalypse one final time, and gain all of those stats. Alternatively, you can just play the Apocalypse and have a 28, 32, 36 power unit on turn 6 of the game and discard something else, which gives you some counterplay to your opponent playing around the lane that Dracula is into, which is super sweet. The Collector is definitely still a card that's been in and out of this deck, but it's a bit of a flex spot, so do consider playing it if you're missing something from pool 3 for this deck. But Dracula combo, Dracula discard, definitely kind of putting up the results this week, and definitely a deck you should be paying attention to if you're looking to grind cubes. Mr. Negative coming up in Tier 2 as well. Mr. Negative, kind of like a well-known quantity at this point. While there is a better deck using the card, it's still just strong enough to warrant its own solo option. And it kind of still ranks in the top 5 decks in terms of like meaningful categories like win rate and cubes per game. When building around solely Mr. Negative, you're basically favouring flexibility over potential. You're choosing to be able to play a fair game if you don't draw your big combo cards. And you can really play cards like Wong, or Jubilee, or even like Gambit, cards that can be played because there isn't enough space to fit them into the negative serotonin shell. Negative just feels a lot better than Sero when it's on its own. Which goes a long way in a powerful, like flexible mid-range strategy. It's strong enough alongside like the on-reveal shell that this deck kind of utilizes with things like Wong and White Tiger to be able to play a fair game, unlike the Sarah decks that if they don't draw Sarah, just kind of get forced to concede. So this is a very fair way to play Mr. Negative. Still some fantastic late game turns, but not quite as much late game potential as Sarah Negative, in exchange for some flexibility instead. That being said, Sarah Miracle does in fact still join Mr. Negative in Tier 2, because it is good enough to be playable on its own. The card is just fantastic. But looking at the data from SnapFan, it appears the Mr. Negative is only doing ever so slightly better than Sarah Solo, but the Solo Sarah deck is still just in the top 5 decks you can play in Marvel Snap. It goes to show you once again this card is just an absolute all-star by itself, and just considers maybe being nerfed in the upcoming patch. We do think there is fewer reasons, however, to play Sarah Miracle at this moment if you do have access to negative serotonin. Compared to Mr. Negative, it doesn't allow for such flexibility, and kind of forces you to play mostly 2 and 3 cost cards to benefit from the endgame that Sarah has to offer. But if you don't have Mr. Negative available to you, this is a shell you can play. You're just trying to utilize Sarah to the best of your ability to have the most ridiculous turn 6 you possibly can by being able to play all these cards for 1 or 2 resources on turn 6. Just gives you a very large amount of stats that your opponent wasn't prepared for. Doing something very similar to Sarah Negative, just less reliant on engines for some more flexibility, but not quite as strong as perhaps just the Mr. Negative shell by itself. So Sarah Miracle still a top contender in tier number 2. Hella Discard. Hella Discard is a really sweet deck. I kind of wish there was more of a reason to talk about this other than it's just like cube farming ability. But if you're not familiar, Hella Discard, very much a deck based around the idea of discarding all these huge gargantuan fatties to reanimate on the final turns of the game with Hella, who pulls back every single card you've discarded on turn 6. Now it's super powerful, and you can try and keep your Hella safe by hiding your discard effects behind Invisible Woman, which means Invisible Woman can, of course, keep them from flipping over until the final turn, and then Hella can flip over afterwards and reanimate all those cards you discarded. We kind of discussed briefly about whether or not we should highlight the Sandman version of this archetype or stick to the more traditional version, but we've gone with the traditional one in this particular case because it has a 4% higher win rate than the Sandman build as things currently stand. But do keep in mind that both decks have roughly the same amount of cube average per game, meaning that you really can pick up both and have a pretty reasonable time. This deck really kind of poses some interesting deck building dilemmas because you're discarding payoffs, and you really do like risk discarding Hella a lot if you don't have access to Invisible Woman. But it does seem to have solidified itself as a good tier 2 option. This is very possibly because Dark Dimension was a featured location pretty recently. That would make some sense. And it definitely did a lot better in that period. We don't think its win rate or cube average is high enough to warrant it being in Tier 1 off the back of that event. So Hella Discard, still a mainstay. Definitely one still worth playing. Lockjaw on reveal. A deck that kind of is a new addition that's come to the tier list from looking at the data. Lockjaw as an archetype looks to abuse that signature card of Lockjaw with a wide array. Oh god, try saying that 3 times fast. A wide array of on-reveal triggers that can go back into the deck and pull out another on-reveal trigger to abuse them as best as they can. It's also kind of the first deck we've seen where Thor and Jane Foster have like significant contributions. These are cards that really haven't found a home otherwise, which is very, very cool. Because you can cheat them into play, get better access to Mjolnir, and just dig up tons of Mjolnirs, essentially, once things go to work if you keep looping Thor back and forth off of Lockjaw triggers, which is super, super sweet. And definitely very valuable. Lets you draw Wasp to trigger Lockjaw again, all kinds of things. Very, very sweet deck. In terms of constructions, it's very similar to a lot of the other Tier 2 decks, which are all like looking to abuse the power of a specific card. Be it Mr. Negative, Sarah, Hela, or Lockjaw. These decks all feel a lot worse when they don't draw their namesake piece, and unsurprisingly this deck feels pretty bad if you can't draw Lockjaw to start flooping fatties or powerful on-reveals into play, and you just have to kind of play them fairly, which is kind of where this deck starts to fall a little short. Wong Going, the fan favourite archetype, finally makes its way onto our tier list this week, falling firmly in Tier 2 based on the data. This deck was originally considered a bit of a meme, which is hilarious to me. But it was the hottest build during like the second part of Season 3. Nowadays, the deck not quite so hyped by the community, but it's really kept itself with a decent rate of play, which means it does make our top 10 decks for this week. The biggest problem for something like Wong Going is it seems to have reached the ceiling pretty fast. The element of surprise was kind of key to this deck's success early, to kind of push the opponent to accept for playing for more cubes. And now that most players know how this deck works, how it operates the cards it plays, it's a lot more complicated to abuse that play pattern of Wong into Mystique into Spectrum to gain 8 cubes every game. But nonetheless, the ongoing synergy is super well represented and can hold itself on its own, even if you don't draw this like pseudo combo piece. Just by playing a fair game, you can just play Wong into Spectrum with all these ongoing creatures on board, and that's a fine end game plan. Which makes it a very valid option if you're looking for something that's always going to be able to play every game that it finds itself in, and it can hold its own against Discard and On Reveal, which makes it one of those best decks in Marvel Snap currently, and definitely worth playing if you were a fan of this favourite in a previous season. Patriot, a deck that I'm dying to be able to play myself, but a card I don't currently have in my own collection path. Bit of a weird inclusion in Tier 2. Not everyone's a fan of this. The deck is the worst of the Tier 2 decks if we look at win rate, which is only 47.9%. It's quite low, less than 50%, definitely worth paying attention to. And it'll probably be in Tier 3 if that was our default measurement. But in terms of average cubes per game, it's ahead of Hela, it's ahead of Wong Going, it's ahead of Lockjaw, which is it almost ties Sarah Miracle, which is kind of crazy. So as a result, it's kind of hard to rank this deck. We've decided to slip it in at the bottom of Tier 2 this week, but we wouldn't be surprised if it makes its way down if it starts winning less cubes in the average game. Patriot is a super powerful payoff card, especially alongside Mystique, duplicating its effect on the final turn of the game, just adding power to everything that didn't start on your deck. And when this is put alongside things like, textless cards, I should say, not things that won't put in your deck, textless cards, alongside things like early statted minions, Misty Knight, Shocker, alongside tokens created from cards like Brood or Debris or Doctor Doom, sometimes even in combination with Onslaught, which is an absurd endgame power punch. The deck just puts a lot of stats on the board, and that is very much what it's all about. Stats, raw stats on multiple bodies. Sad truth is a lot of people don't get to play this deck until quite late, even though all the bots do, because it contains a good chunk of pool 3 cards that are required in order to make the deck work, especially Patriot and Mystique. But if you do have access to the cards, it's a really fun one to play, a very unique way of playing the game, and I highly recommend grinding some cubes with it if you can. Alrighty. Sandwave Lockdown is going to tip off the start of tier number 3 this week. This is one of my favourites. The fact we have an anti-meta choice in Marvel Snap that is viable is really cool to me, and it makes me feel like there's going to be a lot of options that you can kind of enjoy in terms of the way to play Marvel Snap. The goal of this deck, lock out your opponent. Stop them from doing the disgusting things that Sarah Miracle and Mr. Negative are doing. Play one card a turn because it costs 4, or because you can only play one card a turn. And you get to maintain flexibility by playing cards that affect multiple lanes, be it Doctor Doom, Leader, White Tiger, Claw. These are all effects that affect multiple places at the same time while you're only able to play one card. This deck actually posts one of the highest win rates in the game. It's 4th overall at 53.17%, but it suffers a ton from opponents kind of not being interested in playing out games once you wave or Sandman, and you've clearly shut off their endgame. They just escape and deprive you of high cube value games. It's kind of the curse of Sandman, and the reason why Mr. Negative and Sarah are kind of managing to stay at the top of cube acquisition. You only really often get one cube with this deck, and it kind of flattens your potential profits, if that makes sense. But compared to the other high win rate decks in Tier 2, it's still performing, it's still up there, it's still taking names, but you just have less ways of raising the stakes and getting away with it, which is a real downside to playing a deck in Marvel Snap. So, knocks it down to Tier 3 this week. Daredevil Control, another new addition to the list this week, which is really, really sweet. A lot of people, when we talk about Daredevil, kind of expect to showcase the Destroyer build, but this week, the Control archetype definitely putting up better results than its Destroyer predecessor. With Green Goblin and Hobgoblin becoming more important to combat popular combo decks, filling up their slots, taking up space on their board, Daredevil serves as a guaranteed way to make sure those cards don't backfire. It's a really powerful trinity of cards alongside things like Professor X to shut down lanes, to prevent your opponent from using their lanes effectively. Then you can tie this together with Storm Juggernaut, which is obviously another powerful lane denial 1-2 punch. And we say like powerful disruption pieces like Professor X, Magneto, Shang-Chi, Magic to buy yourself extra time. The deck's win rate would put it in Tier 2 with the likes of Sarah and Negative, but the cube average on this one, again, pretty bad, unfortunately. It's really hard to grind cubes with a deck like this, just because opponents are going to retreat once they feel like they're locked out of their usual play patterns. Once you Storm Juggernaut or Hobgoblin or mostly Professor Cheese, in the form of Professor X, stealing a lane, they'll just retreat before you get to the final turn of the game, which is often going to rob you of some cube equi, which kind of knocks this down a peg to tier number 3. And then last but not least, for the highlights in this video, we're going to look at Deathpool. Deathpool Death's a new archetype. It's taken over from the predominantly Death Wave decks that we saw before. And it's looking fine, but not great. Not the Dominator that it was before. This is a mighty fall compared to the times before Sarah and Negative dominance. With a 50.8% win rate, 0.13 net cubes per game. It's a top 20 deck at best, unfortunately. Which is kind of crazy to see, given this was the mainstay of the game for the longest time. This new build, however, offers some crazy potential. You can abuse cards like Deadpool as early payoffs alongside things like Venom, Deathlock, Carnage, destroy all these early game pieces, and look to have your final turn of the game be Wave into Death Taskmaster, so you just dump 24 powers worth of stats on the board in the late game alongside sometimes a very large Deadpool, Taskmaster sometimes just alongside Deadpool to create 2 huge units there as well. The problem is here, unfortunately, the deck suffers from early retreats. Again, it's kind of what's making these decks fall into a lower tier, in our opinion. Whenever you start to